So then we are up to lecture 4 here in Rudolf Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Matthew. And now in this chapter, Steiner talks about the evolution of what he calls the Great Sun Initiate, who was the leader after the Atlantean catastrophe has taken place, who has led peoples eventually into founding the first post-Atlantean epoch of India. This was Manu, who was the great sun teacher amongst each of the oracles amongst the Atlanteans. Had to do with the mysteries of a different planet. There was an oracle of Mercury, an oracle of Venus, of Jupiter, and so forth. So it was the oracle of the sun, who was the primary great individuality amongst them, who then taught the 7 rishis. And the 7 rishis are they're referred to in the Rig Veda. They're traditional. They're actually personifications of the 7 stars in the Great Dipper. But Steiner says so that each of them would have been well trained in their clairvoyant knowledge. Might not have been quite as good as the Atlanteans were, but it was good enough to get the job done. And he says that this teacher also taught Zarathustra, although this must certainly be a reincarnation of him, because we're talking like 1,000 or so years later for the time of Zarathustra versus Manu, at least on Steiner's timeline. And then he is the teacher and initiator of Zarathustra. But then this same individuality, who, as we have already seen, Zarathustra had passed his etheric body to Moses and the astral body to Thoth, Hermes, later reincarnates and appears in the Bible in the Old Testament as this very shadowy, scarcely mentioned individual. He's mentioned like 3 times in the Old Testament. Melchizedek, who is the priest king of Salem that Abraham meets on his wanderings, and that this individual would have spoken to Abraham so as not to startle him by incorporating within him the etheric body of Shem, Noah's son Shem, the 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the descendants of each of whom populate the 3 continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. And so he would have inherited the etheric body of Shem and would have used this to sort of not to startle Abraham. And he brings out, after Abraham has been involved in a fight, he brings out, it specifically says in Genesis, I believe it's Genesis 16, if I'm not mistaken, he brings out bread and wine. And then, of course, later commentators have said that this is a forerunner, a reference to the coming of Christ with the meal of the bread and wine. But Steiner says here that it's a kind of confirmation of the fact that he is passing this sun wisdom along to Abraham so that Abraham can receive this wisdom, that what was originally represented in the cosmic order now has to be represented and transmitted in the blood of Abraham's descendants, and that it's absolutely crucial that it goes through the blood. And then Steiner gets to this point where he says that the blood now of the Hebrews has to mirror what in the ancient mysteries was the cosmic order that is evident in the constellations and in the zodiac. And indeed, I would say not only was this the case in the mystery cults, it was the case in the mainstream world of ancient Sumer, of Mesopotamia. It was Joseph Campbell's hypothesis, and he called this phase of history the way of the celestial lights, starting with Sumer, bringing high civilization into being, first with Sumer, 3500 BC, and then Egypt 500 years after that. There's quite a bit of evidence that Egypt had received the spark from the Sumerians. There's lots of evidence of an affiliation between the two. That the way of the celestial lights has come from the priestly study of the stars. Even though we don't have any concrete evidence that the Sumerians had astrology, I'm certain that they did. But this was told to me. I originally submitted my paper on the Epic of Gilgamesh as a coded journey through the 12 signs of the zodiac, which it is. Trust me on that. I submitted it to the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. I have no idea why, just for a laugh, a knee-jerk, to see what the guy would say. And so the editor writes back to me and he says, oh, well, the Sumerians didn't have astrology because, you see, the oldest texts that we have with astrology on it are the Mullipen tablets. And those date from 1000 BC. The Sumerians are long gone by 1000 BC. This is amongst the later Mesopotamians. And so guys like this, they have to have sense perceptible concrete evidence for anything because they can't use their own brains. We have a God-given spark of a thing called inference and intuition, which we can use to figure things out. We don't need always hard evidence to use your brain to figure something out, which is the fact, namely, that traditions are only written down when they're about to disappear. That's why they're written down, because there's a presupposition that a tradition has long been in existence amongst, passed down orally, through oral transmission. The pyramid texts in Egypt are a classic example. The pyramid texts are the oldest Egyptian texts, written texts, that we possess. They date from the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom in Egypt, from the Pyramid of Unas, where they were written not in papyrus, but they were carved onto Unus's pyramid as a collection of spells, because there was an anxiety that the priests were no longer learning the spells. They weren't remembering them, and they weren't going in to recite the spells in order to keep the Pharaoh's Ka alive in his tomb. So they committed them to writing in the tomb in order to make sure that Pharaoh's Ka would get tended by the magic of the spells. That's just one example among jillions. The fact that the Gospels spring into being right about the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD is another case in point, that we're going to lose this knowledge. Perhaps we're losing, the Romans are destroying everything. We might lose this, so we better get it written down. So we get the Mark Gospel. And then Steiner will say that the Gospel of Matthew in this chapter dates from about the same time. So, no, we know that the Sumerians had astrology. That's a fact. And they studied the stars, and the study of the stars gives you a mathematical orientation with an absolute determinism. You can't pray to the sun to stop rising. It won't. You can't pray to the moon to stop rising. It won't. It's absolutely deterministic, and hence astrology is based on this fatalism, this cosmic determinism that is a priestly thing, a priestly contribution to high civilization, possibly from Spanglish Kosh culture, as we saw his Neolithic amoeba that emerged out of early Neolithic India and the Persian Gulf and East Africa, penetrating up north into or up the Persian Gulf, let's say, into the earliest cities of Mesopotamia, which were Eridu or in Uruk. But be that as it may, this idea of a cosmic order is what Steiner says that should be mirrored in the blood of the Hebrews. And he says that there's a passage that's mistranslated in the Old Testament to the effect that the descendants of Abraham shall be as numberless as the stars. But this is a mistranslation. What it really is supposed to say is that the descendants of Abraham shall mirror the laws of the heavens, the cosmic laws of the heavens, the laws of the stars will be mirrored in the transmission of the blood. And this is affected through the fact that the original 12 tribes are all correlated with the 12 signs of the zodiac. This is a well-known fact. Judah, for example, is Leo, is correlated with Leo. And Issachar with Cancer, and after him, Zebulun with Capricorn, and so on down the list. It's traditional. You can look it up on the internet and find it. They represent the 12 signs of the zodiac because they are taking over this tradition of the way of the celestial lights, let's say, and they're inflecting it differently now into a different order in the epoch of the intellectual soul, or Gebser's mental consciousness structure, or even Campbell's later phase of that he has coming in here with yoga, the way of man. So it's being inflected differently. And so this is the idea that is being passed along through the bloodline here, and the importance of it. And then so Steiner gets into a brief discussion of why he thinks the Matthew Gospel is much older. Most scholars date it around like 80 AD, which I thought intuitively was too old. It should be close to the time of the destruction of the temple, as are, I think, all the three synoptic Gospels, with the exception of John, which is definitely closer to 90. It's a much later text. And he quotes a Talmudic legend to the effect that there's a story from Talmudic literature that a rabbi named Rabbi Gamaliel II is in a dispute over their father's estate with his sister. And so they come in front of a judge who is an early Jewish Christian who knows the traditions of both, and who decides the case in favor of the man by quoting from an Aramaic text. He pulls out an Aramaic document where it says that for Christ came not to destroy the law of Moses, but to fulfill it, which is in the Matthew Gospel. And so there's good evidence based on this story, according to Steiner. This individual had taken part, Rabbi Gamaliel II, in the previous year's destruction of the temple by the Romans. And so this is just a year after it. And there's strong evidence there, a suggestion that the Matthew Gospel is based on an older Aramaic text that is now lost. And then so Steiner he finishes this lecture by discussing the idea that the Essenes now, and also another group that's mentioned by Philo of Alexandria as the Therapeuti, so we have this idea of the two Jesus children. They had first introduced in his earlier gospel, on the Gospel of Luke, which we'll get to after we finish this one, where he talks about the Nathan descent in Luke. There is a different child from the descent in Matthew, which descends through Solomon, both as sons of David, Nathan from the priestly line, Solomon from the line of the rulers. And so that there are these two separate lines. And the Essenes expected two different messiahs, actually, one from the priestly line and one from the line of the kings, of the rulers. But in Christ, we have, as it were, the two joined together in a certain sense. And so he has this idea that the Nathan Jesus has inherited the astral body of the Buddha, whereas the Solomon Jesus, as we have been discussing and as we have seen, has inherited the ego of Zarathustra, which has been prepared, this body has been prepared for it. But at the death of this child, at around the age of 12, the ego of Zarathustra transmigrates and displaces the ego of the Nathan boy, who had hitherto been seen as backward, but appears in the temple at the age of 12, suddenly erudite and eloquent about all matters concerning the Torah and so forth. And but he also had been born with the astral body of the Buddha. But the Buddha, Steiner says, had turned his office over. Apparently he has this idea that you have to be a bodhisattva first before you can become a Buddha. Once you become a Buddha, you never incarnate again. You've achieved release from the round of rebirth, from samsara, and you don't have to incarnate in a physical body again. But nevertheless, that the Buddha appointed another bodhisattva after him to watch over the spiritual affairs of mankind, and that this bodhisattva, who would later be reborn as the Buddha Maitreya, sent an individuality in the direction of the Essenes at about the time under the rulership of King Alexander Jannaeus, which dates about 100 BC. And this was a very problematic king because this individual persecuted the Pharisees. And he was very fond of crucifying them and undertook a massive campaign of crucifixion and persecution of them. And so some scholars think that the Essenes may actually be Pharisees who fled out into the deserts and formed the community of the Essenes. But Steiner then finishes this lecture by saying that there's an individual that this Bodhisattva, Maitreya, or the later Buddha Maitreya, sent this individuality who incarnates amongst the Essenes as a man named Jesus ben Pandira, Jesus the son of Pandira. This is not the Nathan Jesus or the Solomon Jesus, although some Talmudic commentators he says, was circulating around Steiner's time ideas that it was the same individuality because this individual's life is so similar in the sense that this individual was also accused of blasphemy and heresy and then was eventually stoned to death and then hung from a tree, Jesus ben Pandira. And so that's where Steiner comes to an end with this chapter coming down the line here. And I suppose in the next lecture, which I haven't read yet, he'll get into the significance of this individuality named Jesus ben Pandira. So stay tuned for that development.